What if a single entry in a church book could destroy everything we hold sacred? Among yellowed pages filled with births, baptisms, and burials, one record appeared that should never have been written. It was more than a simple mark of sin. It was the seed of a curse. A curse born in candlelight, sealed by trembling hands, destined to stain a family's name, to darken their house, and to haunt an entire town for centuries. And those who dared to speak of it soon discovered that the curse demanded silence most of all. Vermont, 1837. A deep winter covered the mountain town, small and forgotten by God, where every house was built of dark logs, and every resident lived under strict, unbending traditions. Here nothing passed unnoticed. Who broke the fast, who walked the street too late, who allowed themselves an improper glance. Fates were decided not in the square and not in the town hall. They were decided within the church walls, where even a whisper could become a sentence. At the very center stood an old wooden church. Its planks were blackened by age and damp, its windows narrow, as if made deliberately to admit only the glow of candles, never the sun. Inside lay the parish records, kept since the settlement's very founding. Books of baptisms, marriages, and burials. Each page was like a seal of fate, who was born, who departed, who was bound in matrimony. People believed these books were nearly sacred, and that the hand which dared to inscribe a false line signed a sentence not only for itself, but for the entire town. The story was discovered many years later, by accident as such things often are. In the church archives, among dust-covered tomes locked with heavy iron clasps, a young priest stumbled upon a strange volume. The book was fragile, its leather binding cracked at the slightest touch, its pages yellowed, stained with wax and time. Yet among the familiar records, baptized, buried, married, there appeared lines that should never have existed. A date, February 12, 1837, the name of a woman, the name of a man, and scrawled faintly in the margin, nearly erased by time, "Forgive me, Lord." What had happened on that day? Why had the church, a place where fates were bound with heaven's blessing, become the witness of such a dreadful secret? The townsfolk left fragments of testimony, in letters, in diaries, in rare recollections. All spoke of the same thing. That winter was ruled by fear. People rarely left their homes after sunset, hearing in the wind's howl what seemed like other voices. Inside the church lingered the hiss of candles and the weight of prayer. And yet nearly the entire town gathered then within its narrow wooden walls, drawn to witness what they could not name aloud. Some came out of curiosity, some to denounce sin, some to pray for salvation. But none could have imagined that on that day, upon those yellowed pages, there would appear a record that would alter the very fabric of their lives. A record that would stand not as a witness to marriage, but as the source of a curse whose echoes would reverberate through their homes for generations to come. Her name was Eleanor Whitmore, a woman draped always in black, as if mourning was not a passing season of grief but the very fabric of her life. Tall, severe, with a face where no smile lingered and no kindness softened the lines of age, she moved through the town like a shadow. Some whispered she had lost her tears long ago, for even at her husband's funeral her eyes were dry, her expression unyielding. Her husband, Jonathan Whitmore, had been the wealthiest man for miles. He owned sawmills, farmlands, and houses that lined the central square. Generations of Whitmores had ruled here, and Jonathan had only tightened their grip. Farmers leased fields from him. Families rented homes under his name. Workers bowed to the whistles of his mills. Even the church was indebted to him. Candles, hymnals, and chalices had been purchased with his donations. Townsfolk feared him, but they also depended on him, as though their lives themselves were chained to the Whitmore fortune. When Jonathan died, suddenly, After a brutal winter, the town breathed a quiet sigh of relief. But relief turned quickly to dread. For Eleanor stepped into his place, and in her hands power was not softened but sharpened. She was colder than her husband had ever been, and far more relentless. Where Jonathan inspired fear through authority, Eleanor inspired fear through silence, through her unwavering stare, through the sense that she was listening, always, and would never forgive. She had a son, Charles, 21 years old, though he looked older. Pale, tall, delicate, as if molded not by youth but by confinement. His eyes were too calm, too weary, as though he had already endured a lifetime. Neighbors whispered that his mother held him too tightly, denying him freedom, friendship, or escape. He rarely walked among the townsfolk, and when he did, he drifted like a ghost, his voice seldom heard. With Jonathan's death came the question of inheritance. By law, distant relatives could lay claim to parts of the estate, and already those relatives circled like vultures, eager to seize a portion of the Whitmore fortune. Eleanor, however, would never allow the family's grip to weaken. She had given her life to the preservation of power, and she would not watch it slip into other hands. So she made a decision that stunned even the most hardened, that defied both scripture and reason. She would marry her own son. The rumor spread like fire. At first, people dismissed it as slander. Then they whispered. Then they trembled. Some called it blasphemy, others madness, others the work of the devil himself. But deep down, everyone knew. If Eleanor had resolved to act, nothing and no one would stop her. The church became the battlefield of this unholy plan. Reverend Thomas Avery, gray-haired and weary, had baptized infants, buried the dead, and joined couples in marriage for decades. He was a man of respect, a pillar of the community, though age had bent his back and made his hands unsteady. When word reached him of Eleanor's demand, he denied it at first. Then came the summons, not an invitation but a command, to preside over the ceremony. That night, Avery fell to his knees before the crucifix. He prayed until dawn, begging heaven to prevent what was to come. His prayers turned desperate, muttered pleas between sobs, for he knew the truth. Refusal would mean ruin. Eleanor would strip him of his house, cast his family into the snow, end his livelihood with a word. He would lose everything except perhaps his soul. On the 12th of February, 1837, the church overflowed. Narrow aisles choked with townsfolk, doorways jammed with those too curious or too horrified to stay away. The air was thick with candle smoke and fear. People crossed themselves, muttered prayers, or stared with pale, open-mouthed silence. They knew they were about to witness something dreadful. Eleanor entered first. Her gown was blacker than any night, her head veiled, her gloved hands folded as if she were walking to a funeral. Behind her followed Charles, tall, ghostly pale, stiff as if he moved not of his own will but hers. A murmur rippled through the congregation. "Sin," someone whispered. Another voice broke louder. "Stop this!" Yet no one stepped forward. Fear sealed their lips. Reverend Avery stood at the altar, the parish register open before him. Its pages bore centuries of life and death, love and loss. Now it demanded a line that should never exist. His hands trembled. His heart thundered. Refusal meant destruction. Compliance meant damnation. He lifted his gaze. Eleanor's eyes met his, cold, steady, merciless. She knew. She had known from the beginning that he would yield. And yield he did. The quill shook in his grip, ink bleeding across the parchment as he scratched the names. Eleanor Whitmore. Charles Whitmore. He marked the date, February 12, 1837. His hand lingered, frozen in horror, and then, with a gasp, he scribbled a final note in the margin. Not for human eyes, but for God alone. Forgive me, Lord. In that instant, the deed was sealed. The candle flames seemed to bow. Shadows recoiled along the walls, and the congregation exhaled in broken whispers. A curse had been born, not in thunder or fire, but in silence and ink. They left the church pale, some weeping, others shouting, but none able to undo what had been written. And in the minds of all, one truth settled like frost. That day, in the house of God, a mother and son had become husband and wife. The church bells tolled as they always had, but after that winter day the sound carried differently. It was no longer a call to prayer, but a reminder. People who heard the bells whispered to themselves, crossed their chests more quickly, and turned their eyes away from the Whitmore mansion that loomed on the edge of town. What had been done inside the church could never be undone, and though no priest dared speak it aloud, the town was certain. A curse had been born that day. At first, silence cloaked the mansion. Curtains drawn, shutters bolted, servants dismissed without explanation. For weeks, no one saw Eleanor or Charles. The mansion's windows glowed faintly at night, but the figures inside were shadows, pacing behind heavy drapes. Farmers passing by claimed to hear muffled voices, not just two but many, whispering or weeping when the house should have been still. Then came word of a child. Few saw her, for Eleanor ensured she remained hidden. But rumors spread quickly. A servant dismissed for speaking too freely claimed the girl's eyes were too large, too dark, as if no light could ever live in them. Another insisted her laughter sounded wrong, echoing not like a child's joy but like something older, deeper. The stories twisted with every telling. Some said she never cried at all, others that she cried without stopping, her wails rattling the rafters of the house at night. 2 years later, a boy was born. If the daughter had been strange, the son was stranger still. Pale to the point of translucence, he seldom spoke, and when he did, his voice carried a resonance that unsettled the servants. As though two voices speak through one throat, whispered one maid before she fled her position in terror. Another claimed she had seen the boy staring into the fireplace, whispering to the flames as though they answered back. The Whitmore children rarely left their home. Eleanor forbade them from stepping foot in the town, but secrecy only fed the rumors. Some claimed they had seen the children peering from the upstairs windows at dusk, their faces pressed against the glass, their eyes catching the last light of day like an animal's. Others swore they saw them wandering the woods, moving silently between trees, vanishing when called to. Legends sprouted like weeds. Parents warned their children not to stray near the Whitmore land after dark. Hunters muttered about tracks in the snow that began with small bare feet and ended in claw marks. The blacksmith's wife swore she heard a child's voice calling her name outside her door at midnight, though when she opened it, no one was there. In hushed voices, they called them the dark-eyed children. The fear grew not just of the children but of the house itself. Servants who dared remain told stories of locked rooms, hallways where footsteps echoed when no one walked them, laughter that drifted through the halls though no mouth had spoken. One woman insisted she heard a lullaby sung in a language she did not know, a lullaby that lingered in her ears for days after she left. The townsfolk avoided the mansion as though it were a grave. They walked faster when passing by, and some crossed to the far side of the road. Farmers plowing fields nearby found their horses balking, refusing to move closer to the Whitmore boundary. Even the church seemed tainted. Reverend Avery aged rapidly in those years, his sermons heavy with dread, his eyes hollow. He never again touched the parish register without trembling. Yet the Whitmores endured. Their wealth kept them untouchable. Their walls kept them hidden. And behind those walls the children grew, strange, silent, and wrong. More tales surfaced as the years passed. The eldest daughter, some said, could mimic any voice she heard perfectly. Once, she repeated the town doctor's words back to him in his exact tone, though she had only heard them once from another room. The boy, they whispered, never cast a shadow in the candlelight. One terrified servant insisted that when she tried to lift him as a baby, he felt as light as paper, until suddenly he seemed to weigh more than stone. Disappearances fed the legend further. A farmhand vanished near the Whitmore woods. A hunter never returned from chasing deer along the ridge behind their property. Some said the children lured them, their strange voices drifting through the trees like wind. Others swore the forest itself had turned against them, grown thick and twisting, as though the land absorbed the curse that clung to the Whitmore blood. By lantern light, in taverns and kitchens, the stories circled. Some swore the children were marked by the devil. Others claimed Eleanor had bargained with forces beyond mortal reach, trading her husband's soul for the preservation of her estate. A few whispered that the children were not children at all but something else wearing their shape, a lineage that would spread like rot if not stopped. No one dared act. Wealth protected the Whitmores, but fear protected them more. For what if the curse did not end with the family? What if it spread to those who crossed them? The townsfolk chose silence, their fear feeding the very legend they dreaded. But in the quiet of their homes, when the wind howled and shutters rattled, parents pulled their children close and prayed. They prayed not for the Whitmores but for themselves, because the stories had already taken root, and roots, once deep, do not easily die. Yet silence could not last forever. One autumn evening, when the fog rolled down from the mountains and the streets of the town lay empty, a farmer swore he saw two figures standing at the edge of the Whitmore fields. Small, motionless, watching. He raised his lantern, and their eyes gleamed dark, unblinking, unnatural. By morning, word had spread. The Whitmore children had stepped beyond their gates, and if they could walk into the town, then perhaps the curse was no longer bound to the mansion at all. The story should have ended in whispers. Instead, it resurfaced in the 1920s, when the town tried to dress itself in modern clothes and forget the winter of 1837. New storefronts appeared on the square, motor cars coughed along roads that had once only heard hooves, and the old church received new paint that could not quite hide the seams of time. Somewhere beneath that paint, beneath the floorboards and plaster, the past had waited. It was an archivist who woke it. He arrived in 1923. A quiet man in a tweed coat with a leather satchel and the patient voice of someone used to listening to paper. His name was Arthur Bell. He had been hired by the county to recatalog church and town records, to establish a uniform index for births, marriages, deaths, deeds, and probate files. He knew nothing of the Whitmores when he began, or at least nothing more than a librarian hears in passing. That there had been wealth and grief and something people did not like to say aloud. The church records were kept in a small vestry room that smelled of wax and cold wood. The lock had not been changed in decades. Arthur worked there through the late autumn, his breath visible in the air, writing in a neat clerk's hand while the bells hummed the hour above him. He had a method: first parish registers, then civil ledgers, cross-reference with land books, taxation lists, and probate, note anomalies, resolve them with newspapers and cemetery surveys. He did not chase ghosts. He aligned columns, corrected dates, and made the past line up. But it would not line up. The first misgiving came from an absence. Between the entries for February and March of 1837, a half-leaf had been removed, cut clean, not torn. The knife had been sharp, the hand cautious. Arthur noted it in pencil. Gap in register, leaf missing, likely marriage or death entries. He flagged it for later and continued, until the names began to repeat in patterns that were not natural. Whitmore. Again and again. Not just in the obvious places but at the edges of things, where one would not expect a name to intrude. A sponsor at a baptism for a family that owed money. A witness at a boundary dispute. A guardian appointed in a probate proceeding for a child whose parents had died of fever, though no physician had signed the report. And always, beside or beneath the ink of these names, there were marks. A dot in the margin. Faint cross. Once the ghost of a word erased. No. Arthur turned to land records. In 1838, a deed transferred a small strip of forest from the Whitmores to the church for the upkeep of the graveyard. It was a peculiar parcel, narrow, bisecting older plots, and it prompted the relocation of 3 graves. The cemetery map, redrawn, placed the new burials against the Whitmore boundary. The names on the moved stones were familiar to Arthur from a different ledger. A farmhand, a hunter, a woman with no recorded cause of death. He did not sleep well that week. To steady himself, he expanded the scope of his work. He built tables on loose foolscap. Birth date, mother's name, father's name, witnesses, godparents, address, midwife, physician. Then he keyed surnames to property lots, mapped against tax delinquencies, and shaded the overlaps. Patterns surfaced like bruises. The same surname appeared wherever the Whitmore ledgers showed a debt forgiven, or a tenant moved without explanation. In the baptismal pages, godparents repeated with unnatural frequency for a town this size, and the handwriting of the officiant, Reverend Avery, grew more spidery after February 1837, slanting into fear. Arthur sought confirmatory evidence. He requested school attendance rolls from the 1840s and 1850s. Several sheets were missing for winters when the Whitmore children would have been of age. He inspected the county's smallpox logs, carefully kept during epidemics, and found no Whitmore listed as ill, though 2 doctors billed the family for midnight calls and comforting that were clearly not for fevers. In the newspaper archive, brittle and gray, he found a notice dated 1859. Reward for information regarding a lost boy, last seen near the North Woods. No name, no family given. Only a location, one that pressed against the Whitmore line. From documents, he turned to the living. The old doorkeeper of the church remembered a winter when the priest grew thin and would not stand near the registry without crossing himself. A laundress recalled her grandmother's warning to never answer if a child calls you from outside after dark, not unless you see the mouth move. An elderly farmer's widow, fingers like twigs, insisted that she had once heard 2 children chanting a psalm perfectly, though no one in their house could read. Each recollection contradicted another and yet echoed something true. The weight of them settled on Arthur's chest. One afternoon, in the fading light, Arthur found what he later called the hinge. It was not a single document but a set of coincidences that clicked into place with the intimacy of theft. In the 1870s, a series of marriages linked farm families on the outskirts of town to cousins from the next county. Their surnames were not Whitmore, but in each case the bride or groom had, as godparent at baptism, a Whitmore cousin whose relationship was never specified. The signatures on 2 of those marriage licenses looked suspiciously alike. The same tremor in the downstroke of the W, the same pressure on the T-cross. Arthur traced them with his pencil and felt cold. Behind the public names ran another line, the line that did not want to be seen. If the Whitmore line had ended, the coincidences would have ceased. They did not. Census takers in the 1880s listed borders at the edges of Whitmore properties, always 2 or 3, often children, last names that matched no local grave. In the 1896 Overseer of the Poor Ledger, a payment authorized for the keeping of a child from the North Road. No age, no parent. The note was countersigned by a selectman who, in that same year, witnessed a deed for Eleanor's executor. Every path circled back to the same door. Arthur wrote a memorandum to himself, locked it inside his satchel, and began a new set of charts. This time he followed only the surnames that recurred in odd proximity to the Whitmores. Shopkeepers, carters, a midwife, a tinsmith, a schoolmistress. He thought of them as tributaries, and he drew lines of marriage out from each. The lines braided, split, braided again. Dates clustered around winters. Baptisms occurred at twilight. The godparents rotated in a wheel of 10 names, none of them Whitmore, all of them tied by land or debt to that family. And in 3 cases, children were baptized without being present, the priest having been called to the home. One of those homes belonged to a cousin who died a month later, his obituary praising his generosity to friends unnamed. By then the town had warmed to Arthur. People offered him coffee by parlor stoves and told him what they told no one else. A seamstress swore that, as a girl, she had seen 2 children standing by the far fence of the Whitmore orchard, their faces too still, their eyes like wells. A cobbler admitted he had been paid to mend shoes for a boy who never came to the shop, the sizes increasing every spring. A man who had courted his wife in the 1870s said he had once heard singing from the Whitmore woods, 2 voices in perfect unison. No words he could place, a harmony that made his teeth ache. Arthur did not know what to do with the voices. He could only index them. So he wrote them beside dates, beside names, beside the entries where ink was darker or margins were scored. Slowly, a conviction formed not of superstition, but of a presence that insisted on the record. The Whitmore line had not been contained within the mansion. It had seeped outward by law and signature, by sponsorship and quiet arrangements, into the town itself, into families that never took the name. And then, without seeking it, he found modern proof. In a steel file drawer in the town hall, one that did not belong to the church at all, Arthur discovered a folder of correspondence from 1919 to 1922 between the selectmen and a Boston legal office. The letters were routine, taxes, assessments, a bequest for road repairs. But tucked between them was a typed note from 1920, a kind of inquiry whose decorum could not soften its unease. Please confirm whether any members of the Whitmore family remain in residence or under another name. Several individuals of that stock are known to be alive in the 1890s and recorded as late as 1907 in neighboring towns. Attached, in pencil, someone had added, almost as if they could not help themselves. 2 of that name were seen here in 1903 market day, eyes dark as coal. Arthur closed the drawer with shaking hands. He spent the winter verifying what he could. Newspaper notices from the 1900s mentioned a Mrs. W. donating blankets to the church. A school ledger from 1908 recorded the temporary enrollment of a boy with an unfamiliar surname who withdrew after 3 weeks. The teacher had written, privately, voice peculiar, sings well, does not play with others. In a 1912 poorhouse report, a woman, elderly, no family, had listed her birthplace as near the Whitmore Lane and later, in the infirmary, murmured in her sleep an old hymn in a clean double line. The final confirmation came from a different decade altogether. In 1971, during a renovation of the church basement, workers uncovered a box sealed with wax and twine. The box contained papers, Arthur's index cards among them, his tables and maps spotted with damp, and a short letter he had written in 1924 but never sent. The letter summarized his findings with the restraint of a clerk and the fear of a man who knew he would not be believed. At the end, he had written one sentence that the pastor in 1971 copied into the parish bulletin before locking the papers back in a new drawer. If the family ended, it did not end with the name. That same year, a visiting genealogist, curious about the bulletin note, walked the cemetery and the land boundaries and spoke with the oldest parishioners. He left behind a memo of his own. It listed 3 households in the 1960s and early 1970s bearing surnames not found before 1880, all with marriage sponsors who connected, by a chain of 4 links, to the Whitmore estate. 2 of those households had children with unusually dark eyes. One child, a girl, was said to sing in an unervingly pure unison with her brother. The archivist's charts, the letters, the school rolls, the poorhouse report, the renovated drawer. Each piece said the same thing in a different key. The line had bent, hidden, and persisted. Arthur Bell died in 1926 of a sudden illness. He left no family, only the order he had tried to impose on chaos. His notes slept in their box until the 1970s and then were sealed again. But the town remembered other things. It remembered market days when strangers looked too long at the church door. It remembered a woman who would not let her grandchildren play near the North Road. It remembered the winter when the bells sounded the hour and old men turned their faces to the floor. No one speaks the Whitmore name now, not as it was. But the records do. And the records do not lie. The cursed line did not break. It learned to go by other names. By the late 20th century, the Whitmores had become less history than rumor. The town had grown, paved roads cut through the hills, and supermarkets replaced the old mills. Yet, in the corners of coffee shops, in the back pews of church, people still whispered the name. It was not spoken loudly, only when the wind howled against the windows, only when the night seemed too long. For most, it was a story to frighten children. For a few, it was a memory too sharp to dismiss. In 1989, a man named Harold Green, retired schoolteacher, stood before the local historical society and said what many had only thought, "I met them." His voice was thin with age, but steady. He claimed that in the late 1970s, while walking near the northern ridge, he encountered a family of 4. A man, a woman, 2 children. They spoke politely, asked for directions to town, and moved on. Nothing unusual except the way they looked. Their eyes, Green said, were dark as coal, and their faces, so pale they seemed carved from wax. I could not forget them, though I tried. First, his story drew laughter. But Green produced something else. A clipping from the local newspaper, dated 1974. It was a small article about a charity fair, accompanied by a black and white photograph. In the picture, blurred but distinct, a couple and their 2 children stood at the edge of the crowd. Their clothes were plain, their posture stiff, yet the faces angular, severe, with the unmistakable dark, deep-set eyes, drew gasps from those who looked too closely. The Historical Society dismissed it, calling it coincidence. But copies of the photograph began to circulate quietly. Young people said the family resembled portraits preserved in the church archives. Old people refused to look twice. The resemblance was too exact, as though time itself had bent to preserve the Whitmore blood. By the 1990s, sightings multiplied. A pair of strangers seen at a funeral, standing apart from the mourners, never speaking. A boy enrolled briefly in school, withdrawn after a few weeks, his voice described as strange, like 2 notes at once. A woman shopping at the market who never returned, leaving behind only the memory of eyes too dark for daylight. The legends deepened. That the Whitmores had never died out, that their line survived by shedding names and blending with neighbors, only to surface in odd places and moments. Some said the family moved every few years, never leaving a trace, their children always slightly too silent, their gazes too heavy. Others believed the curse itself had grown clever, allowing its carriers to walk unnoticed, feeding on secrecy. Even now, old-timers in Vermont insist the Whitmores remain. They tell their grandchildren not to answer if a child calls from the woods after dusk. They warn against photographs where figures appear in the background uninvited. And they point to the newspaper clipping, yellowed and fragile, with its family of 4 whose faces seem both familiar and wrong. The Whitmores are not gone, the stories say. They are here, scattered, hidden behind borrowed names. The curse never ended, it only learned how to live among us. Some curses fade into dust. This one walks in silence. Look closely the next time a stranger passes you on the street, and ask yourself whose eyes are staring back.